it's time for another Beetlejuice building video. I've been having a lot of fun in the netherworld, creating all sorts of characters. However, the house is still lacking. So I pulled out my trusty practice model to try and figure out what the next steps should be. Should it be the tower? Should I go ahead and work on the interior of the kitchen? And the answer to both of those is yes. However, I realized my structure is missing an entire floor, and I really think it's going to be the next step in getting closer to the iconic Beetlejuice house look. If you look at the reference photos, you will notice there is a very thick foundation, and that foundation is where the garage is held. Originally, I wasn't planning on creating the garage because I knew this house was going to be gigantic anyway, but I had a really good idea on how I could use the garage. So in this video, I'm going to be working on that base, kind of walking you through my ideas, and it's gonna be one of those projects that is a ton of dry time. Yeah, those happen, and we just have to get through them. Kind of like shingles. But I do think this is going to make a huge impact on the look of the house. So let's get started. This first floor has been sitting flat on the base for quite a while now. Now it's time to build something underneath it. And the requirement at the beginning of any project I do recently is to realize you don't have enough of what you need to even really get started. I need quite a bit of this pink foam board, and this is all I have. So I have to leave the studio, which I hate to do, and go out in public to get some more supplies. And it looks like we're going to be building quite an expensive hill underneath this house. Tried to use my awesome karate skills to get it into the car. That didn't work so well, so I just did it the normal boring way, put it back into the car, and headed home to actually get started on this project. My plan is to start with the foundation pieces directly underneath the first floor, and then slowly I can build up until I have a hill that fills the entire square space that is the top of this base piece. So I'm just tracing underneath the first floor, and I'm going to carefully cut that out with my box cutter. I'm using a ruler to try and get as straight lines as I can. Thankfully, this stuff is pretty easy to snap in half once you get a deep line cut into it. After I get it cut into a much smaller piece, I can go ahead and try to get all of the details of the shape of the first floor cut. With this piece done, I can start to imagine how this is going to look in the end. And I also need to figure out the direction of the house. There is a rather large piece or a porch that comes off of the front of it that Delia has built, and I want to incorporate that as well. So I'm keeping that in mind as I make my decisions. I also want to cut out the interior of this base. I want the foundation to be hollow because there's going to be quite a few things that go into this base, such as electronics, wiring for lights, and then I do come up with an idea for the garage, which I will be building in a future video. This is how it's looking. I'm making sure that it's wide enough so that it does sit on top of this hole, which allows the wires to come up through the base, which is where all of the wiring is going to be hooked together. Cutting this shape out over and over again as one big piece is not going to work. It's going to eat through my foam board pretty quickly, so I'm cutting them out of smaller pieces that I have cut out, and I'm just going to have to piece each one together. While I was in the middle of this project, I did get an order that I had put in. I got a really good deal on this foam wire cutter. I have never tried one of these before, and I thought this would be the perfect project to try it out on. Before I get started on that, I'm going to glue the pieces that I have. I'm gluing as I go because this is just going to become one really complicated puzzle if I don't stay on top of where each piece is supposed to end up. I've got the wire cutter plugged in, I've got a mask, I've got the filter running, and it's time to test out this wire cutter. It did work pretty well cutting through the foam. It would definitely save on a lot of hand pain. However, it made a ton of smoke, and it really just made this kind of gooey look to the edge of the foam, and it was really stringy and honestly just kind of gross. So I decided it probably wasn't going to be the best way to go forward because I had many more pieces and many more layers to cut, which means it was going to be a lot of smoke and fumes. So I've decided I'm going to use the wire cutter pretty sparingly and continue to cut by hand on these pieces, so it's going to take me a while. The key here was just to continue to trace with a pencil and make sure I cut and glued as I went along. Each one of these foam board pieces is 1 inch thick, so this is a 3-inch thick foundation that I've already cut. Here you can see me testing the first floor on top of it to make sure it looks right. Now I also want to add some more supports along the front. They have these like support pillars in the movie. And I also need to create the hill. This is going to be sitting up a little bit higher because a 3-foot tall garage is not going to work. It's still only going to be about 6 feet tall, so it's going to be smaller than probably what it should be, but taller than 3 feet. The part I'm working on now is going to be the very top layer of the hill. So I'm making the edges just slightly outside the boundary of my foundation, and I'm also continuing to cut out the interior because I need the cavity inside of the base to continue to go all the way to the top of the wooden part that contains the underworld. The second layer of the hill is going to be slightly bigger, and it's just going to continue to spread out until I've filled up the entire area that's available to me. As you can see on one side, the side where the garage is going to be, I'm leaving it pretty flat, and that's because there has to be this drive area where you can drive up and into the garage, which goes underneath the house. But the area in front of the house can be really hilly, and I want it to build up from the bottom of the base all the way to the front part of the foundation. After all of that, this is the total height of my foundation plus hill. It is 6 inches that I am adding to underneath my already created first floor. This is how it sits on top. And oh yes, I also have to create the little columns that hold the edge of the porch. This was just a practice piece so I could see how it looked. This is the area I've decided to make into the garage. I think it will be a really cool alcove to put in some Beetlejuice houses that were sent in for the project that aren't going to fit on the attic table. I also wanted to see about how high this house is going to be. So the second floor is at the top of the stairs, and then there's going to be the attic floor above that. So it's going to be a pretty big project. Because of its size, I think it's going to be most beneficial to keep the hill and foundation separate from both the first floor and the base. To do this, I'm going to be creating a false top for the base out of foam board. This is going to allow me to take it off, and I can turn it sideways to get it through the door. All the floors are going to be built similarly where they come apart, kind of like a layer cake, so that everything can eventually leave my house and it's not stuck in this room forever. I cut off one edge of the foam board piece, and I was so thankful that it lined up perfectly on this other side to cover the entire base. I just had to cut one more little square to complete the entire base and add my foam board pieces on top. So this is really the final decision-making moments where I have to be 100% sure on what direction I want this house to face. And I made my choice. There's no going back. I'm now tracing it onto the foam board to make sure once I get the glue on the underside of the foam, I know exactly where it's going. I also need to cut out the interior of the foam board because again, I have to make sure I can get to the table. At this point, I was thinking more about the garage project because I do think it would be really cool to have it as a display room. In the movie, it's a room where Adam also does some of his work, so it makes sense that he would possibly have some models sitting down there. Maybe not as many as I will have, but I think it would be fun to have it all lit up and have shelves of beautifully made houses that you all have sent in. So now the white foam board piece has an area that will be the floor of the garage. Now I just need to cut out the hole for the garage, and I'm using this foam cutter. This was so much easier than me trying to cut through it by hand because it's 6 layers of foam. I'm trying to go as straight as possible. It's not perfect, but hopefully I can cover it up with some stone work later. I can definitely see this wire cutter coming in handy for projects in the future, but I'm definitely going to be using it sparingly, as I said, especially since Stormy gives me the saddest faces when I lock her out due to fumes. All by myself, don't wanna be all by myself. After the cut was complete, I could bring everything in and make sure that it lined up with my vision for the garage area. I'm pretty happy with the results, so now I can glue it all down. Everything so far has been glued together with hot glue, but once I start adding all the mediums to make it look like a hill and to add the brickwork, it's all going to act like a second layer of glue over the face of the foam that's going to keep everything together. Hot glue dries pretty quickly, but I definitely wanted this to lay flat, so I put my 1, 2, 3 blocks on top while the hot glue cooled. At this point, I decided to do a little bit more sculpting on the layers of the hill. I wanted there to be a bit more of the second layer coming out so that it was easier to build the columns that go underneath the porch. So I added in some foam, and later on I can fix the holes. It doesn't have to be perfect because it's all going to be covered. Off camera, I made some stacks of foam. I want it to be smaller towards the top and get larger towards the bottom. And then I cut them each carefully so that it fit against the layer of the hill, and everything, hopefully, fingers crossed, will work together once it's all covered. Speaking of that, I'm going to be doing my first layer of aluminum foil. This is going to help me cover up any imperfections, such as these holes wherever I extended the foam, and it's also going to make a more gentle slope going from each layer to the next layer down. I don't want it to look like stair steps, I really do want it to look like a hill. The foil is also going to help me keep the weight of this piece down, because the more foil that I can add, the less clay I have to add later on. I'm just using hot glue. I'm forming it to the layer first and then gluing it down once I'm happy with how it looks. And then I can just continue out towards the next layer down, adding a little bit as I go. This takes a little bit of practice, and I had to go back on several layers because I wasn't quite sure if I had it smooth enough. However, the clay I plan on using does have quite a bit of lumps and bumps in it, so it will help give it a more natural look, and it won't look as flat as it does with just the plain foam. This took a while. Honestly, every single part of this project took a while, so I just grabbed a chair, grabbed my supplies, and took my time going around each side. It was really helpful to use a brayer in this situation to go over the top of the aluminum foil. Even after pressing it down by hand, it can still be pretty pokey, and the brayer just helped smooth everything out, and it really did help me also see where I needed to add more foil because it wasn't looking quite rounded enough. This is how it looks all around the edge. This took one entire box of 75-foot roll of aluminum foil, but I'd like to get the cheap kind because it is much easier on your hands and you don't get as many cuts working with it. So I definitely suggest gloves as well if you have really sensitive skin. So now it's time to make the clay that's going on top. I have used the Ultimate Paper Mache clay recipe for several years. I'm going to be making kind of my own version and just really making the clay by feel because I've made it so many times, but I will put a link to the original recipe, which I highly suggest, because that recipe will have amounts and names of brands for you that work the best. I'm just using what I have. And because I don't need this clay to be very smooth because it's going to be terrain, I'm not worrying about following everything exactly to the recipe. But if you've never made it before, I highly suggest you follow it. I soaked 2 rolls of toilet paper overnight because I've decided to make a double batch. In the morning, I wrung out all the water that I could and I was left with these lumps. After that, I could add in some spackling. This is not the brand or the type of compound that Johnny suggests, but it's the kind that I had and it worked for me. After that, I'm going to be adding some Elmer's glue to feel. And because I've made this before, I just mixed it together and added little bits here and there to feel until it was the consistency I remember making from the original recipe. After that was done, I was ready to get back working on the project. Now, before I added any clay or anything with moisture, I hadn't added any moisture yet. It's all been hot glue, aluminum foil, and foam. I needed to clamp down the foam board to the base. And anywhere I couldn't add a clamp, I added a 1, 2, 3 block. Because once I start adding clay, everything's going to want to warp. With clamps in place, I was able to start spreading the mixture all along the face of the hill. This is not going to be going up on the foundation of the house, it's just going to be making up the terrain. It takes a bit to get it to spread, especially because I didn't take the time to get the lumps out. I actually wanted the lumps in it because I think it'll give it a much more natural look. But you can spread it out pretty good still, and so I'm trying to get it as flat as possible while still covering the foil and the foam, because this is going to make my clay go a little bit further. I wasn't quite sure if I had made enough, even though it looked like quite a bit of clay. The double batch didn't quite cover the entire base. Once the surface was no longer sticky, I used the brayer again to flatten out the surface as much as I could, and I left in a few brayer sounds for you. It's just a beautiful sound, as you can tell. My double batch of clay is completely done, and I wanted to show you how far it went. I was still pretty impressed because this is a gigantic project, but I was just shy a little bit, so I decided to make one more batch of the toilet paper clay. While that was soaking overnight, I decided to get to work on the stones for the foundation. The egg carton technique would be perfect because egg cartons just have that really cool stone texture, but I don't have enough egg cartons to go around this entire foundation. So I decided to get some craft foam from the craft store, and I'm going to be using some wire brushes to texture the surface. I tried aluminum foil, but I wasn't getting the look that I wanted, and once I found this really gnarly old wire brush and a wooden mallet, I really started to get a stone or CMU type texture, and it was pretty easy to create. Then I just cut them into 1/2 inch strips and then further into 1 inch chunks. This pretty easily gave me a lot of bricks, and because the foam is pretty soft, it was easy to cut, and then once I started working on the base, if I needed to make them into any special shapes, it was just easy to do with a pair of scissors. For my stone mortar, I'm going to be using some lightweight spackling by DAP, and it's basically like icing a cake. I'm just putting a big chunk of it on one side and trying to get it as smooth as possible. Then I added a little bit of tacky glue on the back of the foam. I'm not quite sure if this is necessary, but I call myself an over-gluer, and I don't want there to be any chance that these stone pieces will come off. And I've never used foam before, so I wanted to make sure I had as best a chance as possible that they would stay stuck. And then I just cut off any pieces after it dried and started on a new section. I put each piece in place by hand. I didn't use a grid, I just kind of eyeballed it, but I wasn't really worried if the stones were 100% perfectly lined up. I just wanted the top layer to be lined up. That was what I was most worried about, and thankfully I had the top of the foam and I knew that was going to create a straight line. As I worked on each individual panel, I was worried that the wall was going to look a little wonky just because they weren't as straight as they could be. However, wonky is kind of the name of the game when it comes to this Beetlejuice project, and it turned out okay in the end. Once the spackling had started to dry a little bit, if there were any pieces kind of jutting out, I could push them down with my finger, and it kind of looked like the mortar in between the stones had come out and dripped down whenever the masons were originally building the wall. I also had to do the same effect on these pillars. They were a little bit more to try and cover with the spackling because they were an uneven surface. But in the end, I think I got it to work. As the wall started to dry, I could add a little bit more of the toilet paper mixture clay up against the wall, making it seem like the ground and the wall had been in contact for years, and there wasn't that gap where you could still see the aluminum foil. I had initially left that gap there so I could make sure and get the stonework all the way down the front of the foundation, but now I can cover it up a little bit. And on the edges of the pillars, because I didn't want the bricks to look like they were just flat pavers, I covered the edges or the corners of each pillar and actually the corner edge of each foundation with a little bit more spackling. That way you couldn't tell that the foam pieces were individually cut and they look like they could be a bit more solid. It's finally done. All the clay, all the bricks, it's on there. And it's dry, so we've got kind of a cast over the entire project. Hello. So the next thing I need to do is paint everything, and I'm going to mix the paint with Mod Podge so everything has a clear coat over it. And I think that's all I'm going to be able to do in this video because by now this is day 5 of working on this, and I'm ready to take a break from this and be done with this for a little bit. I had a bottle that only had a little bit of green left in it, so I added the equal amount of Mod Podge and then mixed it up. So now I can paint this base color and protect the clay work all at the same time. I'm going to carefully go around the pillars, however I do intend to paint the wall, so if I get a little on the wall it's not that big of a deal. It's more important that I get a good protective coat over the clay. This is how it looks once the green is on there. It's pretty bright, and I do have this feeling of making some kind of junior high fort project or one of those projects where you have to make a landmass or something. But hopefully once I start painting the wall, it will feel a little bit more Beetlejuicy. So this is a mixture of black paint and Mod Podge, and this is going to protect my stonework and all of the grout work that is on the wall. I'm making sure to get up and over the foam, and I'm adding a little bit extra Mod Podge at the very edge at the top of the foam so that there's no chance that any of the bricks will be ripped off as the first floor is being taken on and off of the project. This again took a while. I was trying to make sure to get in all the cracks and crevices, and after laying that many bricks, there were quite a few. In the movie, after Delia makes all of her changes in the makeover of the house, you can tell that the foundation has black and white stripes. Her stripes are every 2 layers of stones. However, mine are going to be every 1 layer because it's only 3 inches high and my stones are pretty big. It wasn't super easy to keep this line of white paint straight because my stones weren't super straight, but I decided to go ahead and go for it, and then I could go back with some black and clean up the edges. And this process worked pretty well. And in the end, I think it looks good enough. And I just could not help myself from adding a layer of black acrylic watered down paint because I felt like I could age it up a little bit. In the movie, it is very nice, crisp, and new. However, for me, I just wanted to take the white back a little bit. I wanted it to blend more into the wall. And in a similar mindset, I wanted to bring out the black stones a little bit more, and so I dry brushed some gray paint over the top. This is going to bring out the details of the stones in the black rows and really just give the whole wall a cohesive look, like it really is stacked up stone. This is how it looks. I am so happy with how it came out. And after seeing the wall next to the grass area, which by the way, I'm not adding grass onto this part until later in the project because I don't want to crunch it or mess it up with glue spills. I'm just going to age it so that I have a good base that I can work on a little bit later. Before I show you the final shots of everything put together, I did want to show you some houses that came in recently. Sheena made these awesome tiny houses for the diorama and these little binoculars for Charles to be looking out his office. Catherine of Wasted Talent Arts made this Addams Family house to go into the project, which I think is so fun, and she made a video over it, so link in the description. Monica made this really cool bistro with my name on the front of it, which is absolutely beautiful, and she also made this atlas for the captain's quarters, which is going to be perfect for that project. Kimberly made this amazing little blue house, which she said was her first miniature, and I'm always so honored to hear when I have someone's first miniature they've ever made. Sheena and Catherine, who made the houses you just saw, also sent in these velvet skeleton Elvis paintings in separate packages. They don't know each other, but they complement each other so well. They sent them for the Fairfield, and I'm so excited to put them into the project. I just thought that was such a fun coincidence. I also wanted to say a big thank you to Amanda Gatton, author of Little Paper Worlds. She sent this amazing book with beautiful illustrations for paper dolls and paper miniature scenes. I will leave a link for that in the description as well. And along with the book, she sent so many amazing little paper dolls that are Beetlejuice. They're just all the characters from the movie and the Netherworld, and so you will be seeing these around my project. They are in 1/12 scale. They're going to be perfect to help me out, especially while I don't have all the dolls made. They're going to be so fun to put around and help me with the building process. Thank you to everyone who has sent in a house for the Beetlejuice diorama that's going to be in the attic. There's still time to send one in. You can check the description of this video if you want to learn a little bit more and see the video where I originally talked about this project idea. So I think that's where I'm going to have to stop for today, for this week. This has been several days. Let's see. I guess it's been a full 7 days of me working on this project because there's been a lot of cutting and painting and dry time, and also making some finite decisions, because now that this is done, the location of the house is set in stone, or technically set in toilet paper. I still need to create the garage space or the alcove where I plan to put in some of the houses that you've sent in. So that will probably be its own dedicated video. And of course I also need to add in the grass itself and some shrubberies around the columns, and that's all going to make it look a little bit more real and a little less claymation. Nothing wrong with claymation, but that's not the ultimate goal for this project. I'm also not going to be removing any of the clamps for probably another 4 or 5 days. And when I do, I have this clay that I created with the toilet paper mixture that's in the fridge. If you do make this, you can keep it in the fridge for about a week or so, and then I can fill in any of the spots that are left by the clamps. But a lot of times when you're working with moisture and foam board, it can still warp if there's any moisture left in it. So I am going to wait a while because I don't want any chance of this flat foam board that I've worked so hard to keep flat. I don't want any chance of it warping. So I'm just gonna be patient and wait. So that's all I have for you today. I'll leave you with one last look of how the house looks when it's sitting on the foundation. It was so exciting to finally see the house sit up on its perch. It was one of those things where you're like, I've done all this work and now I get to enjoy it. I get to sit back and look at it. And I was so happy. I'm happy with the pillars in the front lawn. I'm happy with the black and white stripes. Even though they're a little bit dirty, I think they still read as they're supposed to. And I really didn't want them to take away too much from the house. But I really like the proportions as well. I think 3 inches for the foundation built up on a slight hill is just going to be perfect and not add too much height. And then also on the side with the garage, I think this is going to be such a fun detail. I can add shelving and tables in there to hold all the little houses that aren't going to be in the attic. I can add some lights, and it's really going to be this showcase, this display area for the houses that were sent in for this project. And I think it's just going to be so fun. I'm looking forward to seeing that so much. I'm pretty happy with the result. I'm pretty happy that this part is in existence now, and I feel a lot more comfortable to continue to move forward with this project. I hope you all have an amazing week, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. That's it, Storms. And I'm going to mix the paint with, thank you. I've been having a lot of fun in the netherworld. Ooh, got the zoomies now, huh? This has seen better days, but it's still helpful.